Well, I am coming up on 2 years and two particular different points of significance. The first one is that December 8th, 2022, I actually formed my delivery and transport operation in that I applied for an LLC. It was done online through the Secretary of State of South Carolina's website, and the business was formed. So on a Friday night, in fact, you would say the Friday night 2 years ago, as today is Friday, December 6th, 2024. The other significant 2 year anniversary is going to be December 16, which is the day that I purchased my Sprinter slash cargo van, which took me to yet another level in delivery and transport. In that, now I put myself in a position of having a greater earnings capacity. Well, throughout this year, 2024, I've talked about how I've seen the marketplace change dramatically. My challenge throughout this year was how would I adapt to the changes? Needless to say, I've gone through some rough patches. The first 6 months were rather close to the trend that I'd established over the final 6 months of 2023. Some of it was masked by a month of February in which I overachieved. I had my second highest gross earnings month in which I earned over $11,000. And then I had months of April and June that was somewhat consistent numbers wise with how I finished out 2023. Yet reality for me was what I anticipated would occur during the third quarter of 2024. I spoke in some Gig Geezer segments how things were trending downward, and those numbers would intersect somewhere around the months of September and October, which they did. They were also my worst months since 2020 in terms of monthly earnings. And they were my worst 2 months since ownership and operation of within the they were my worst 2 months since I'd taken on ownership and operation of a Sprinter slash cargo van, and for that matter, with my going forth with the delivery and transport enterprise. Now, as of December 2nd, the numbers that I've kind of compiled, at least to me, are somewhat interesting. I've mentioned also in the past that my delivery and transport operation is based on four components: gig food delivery, last mile gig delivery, brokered opportunities slash expediting, and then you can throw in other 1099 slash cash game opportunities. But the main numbers I'm going to talk about over the next few moments are with the gig food delivery, last mile delivery, and brokered opportunities or brokered slash expediting opportunities. Now, overall in 2023, I grossed within gig food delivery work over $28,400. So far in 2024, I have grossed on gig food delivery opportunities or gig food delivery work just a tick over $20,000. Now, I mentioned throughout 2023 that one of my aspirations was being less dependent upon gig food delivery apps. I've often said though that they would always remain an option, but not my main option, as they were between the years 2020 and most of 2022. When it comes to last mile gig delivery work, for as much as I mentioned about how last mile delivery apps have paid less, at least what I've noticed throughout 2024, I still worked on adding more options while continuing to generate revenue. I also had to accept the reality that certain apps that I once enjoyed as big revenue producers were no longer among those top tiered options. So, what I mean by that, last mile gig delivery app opportunities or last mile gig delivery apps. We're talking about, for example, the Bungees and the Synpexes and freight. Overall, in 2023, I earned just a tick over $30,500. So far in 2024, I've earned just a tickle. I've so far in 2024, I have earned just over $39,150. So, yes, I've seen that decrease in earning. I've seen a decrease in money making opportunities on certain apps. Yet I've also been able to be onboarded with a few other apps, or I've just simply been able to catch the right opportunities whenever they've come my way. Now, brokered opportunities, I think I could talk a little more about them in that the main thing I experienced in 2024 was that I have been on fewer brokered slash expediting opportunities. But what I improved upon from last year was my earnings. What I improved upon from the previous year was my earning more per delivery based on dollars per mile earned. Now, some of that was a better understanding of the market. And as I shared in past Gig Geezer segment, I shared how, based on the sampling of various brokered slash expediting opportunities, that I had earned right at about double than what I did when I first started. So, what were my numbers? Overall, in 2023, I'd earned just under $29,000. The exact number, $28,963. So far this year, I've earned just over $29,300. Again, fewer opportunities, but I've earned more per mile in those opportunities. Now, while I may not have been effective at explaining during the first half of 2023 how I first made a transition from more than 75-80% of my money being earned by gig food delivery apps. What I didn't explain as effectively was that I was also incorporating last mile gig delivery opportunities and eventually brokered slash expediting opportunities. What contributed to that growth was my being onboarded with various last mile gig delivery apps, as these apps were onboarding drivers in South Carolina. You add those apps along with my eventually becoming more comfortable with booking my own brokered opportunities, and it appeared as if I'd finally found my stride, and it showed. I ended last year having reached $10,000 in monthly earnings in each of the last 6 months. So that means from July through December, I earned at least $10,000 each month. Now, admittedly, it was nice knowing that there was always a potential of earning several $100s in a single day, and I was able to earn with some consistency at least $2,000 or more in a single week. And they were also some stated goals of mine that I think I felt that I accomplished last year. In 2024, the only consistency that I could talk of was the inconsistency in my dollars earned, and then ending this year having seen monthly earnings that rivaled prior to my ownership and operation of a Sprinter slash cargo van. Now, I don't have any outlook for 2025. There's just too much uncertainty. Comparatively speaking, I had voiced some goals in private to my queen when we entered 2024. And I like to think that I've ended this year finally having put myself in a position to realize some of those goals. But realistically, as I also said in a recent Gig Geezer segment, I feel as if I'm still 6 months to a year behind in the moves that I have made. Now, all of this leads me into something that was brought up during my recent live stream in which my daughter Sarah the Mage gave insight into the future of delivery and transport based on some analysis performed by McKinsey and Company. Now, you take it for what it's worth by these guys, because they've been in the news recently in which they've agreed to pay $123 million bribery settlement for their within their South Africa operations. Now, the content that we covered did serve as a reminder of how we need to be apprised of the changes that are on our immediate frontier, as well as the immediate and distant future. I compared it to becoming a student of the game, borrowing a sports analogy. We need to take time for these realities. Now, it's likely that there are opportunities ahead, but there's also the reality of changes. And within change, some of us will be phased out as businesses and entire industries evolve. Now, I've often quoted something a former newspaper colleague of mine, the late Brian Monroe, told me back in 1990, that he said, someday people will be reading their newspapers from their TV sets. And as I've admitted or I've shared from time to time, I didn't want to hear that, given that I was 2 years removed from having earned a journalism degree. And here I was trying to work my way up the business. Well, we're coming up on 2025. We can not only read a newspaper from a TV, but also from a computer screen, a flat monitor, a watch, and a phone screen. And if you look back in time, the beginning of those changes came with the internet back in the mid 1990s. And at that point, newspapers essentially became an afterthought. Now, for what it's worth, here's a personal trip down memory lane. Back when I got into the business, which was in the mid 1980s, but when I worked at my first daily newspaper, which was 1989, and then when I had access to my first, quote, laptop, newspapers, when we filed our stories, we sent our files over a modem, over a coupler. Actually, you used a telephone receiver. You had these couplers, you put the couplers into the receivers, and those files are sent at a 300 baud rate. That was the rate. That's how you measured the speed. And then we thought, once laptops with floppy disk drives became more commonplace, we thought that 1200 baud rate was like a Japanese monorail. Now, the computers that we used back then was a TRS 80, or what we used to call Trash 80s. They were made by Radio Shack. Those are the ones that had a capacity of like 64,000 kilobytes. That's it, 64,000 kilobytes. And those are the ones that sent at a baud rate of 300 speed. The early laptops also were bought at Radio Shack, had maybe about 500 kilobytes of memory. Some of the early laptops that I recall had 1 to 4 megabytes. And that was actually more than what the Apollo spaceships had. But when the internet came about, the most popular way of gaining access to the internet was America Online, which is around mid 1990, somewhere about 1994 to 1996. And the rate in which data was transmitted was at 14 kilobytes. 14 kilobytes. Now we're talking memory capacity of one terabyte, 2 terabyte, 5 terabytes of memory. We're also talking about Wi-Fi. And if your internet isn't hitting 100 megabytes, you've got a horrible connection. You've got a very slow connection these days. And we're also talking of phone systems in which they have 5G capacity. Of course, back then, no Amazon, no Facebook, no Google, at least not yet. There was no Yahoo. There was Lycos as your search engine, and there was WebCrawler as your major search engine. There were no USB ports, no USB-C ports. Data that was once stored on floppy disks were also transitioning to being stored on CD-ROM. And admittedly, I lost some cooking recipes because I failed to make the transition from the floppy disk to CD. But the other thing too back then was that TVs. Well, you don't see a TV with a CRT tube, or what we used to call the boob tube. What you have now are all flat screen TVs, but there were TVs with the big tubes behind them. And hey, the last one I bought cost $39.99. It was a 13-inch TV, and that was like 2005, 2006. But how does this pertain to delivery and transport? Well, put it like this. The last mile delivery space is where how many of us have entered into the gig economy, and it's become a part of our personal lives and daily lexicon of many. While it's easy to say that we need to find a way of dealing directly so that we can cut out the middleman, that is, brokers and the gig apps themselves, various companies are more inclined to deal with gig app companies because they can guarantee businesses something that we can't. Oftentimes, a true network of people available to deliver the items that meet the business and customer needs and demands. The hardest thing I find as a small business person is finding people that you can trust. It doesn't seem to matter what kind of operation it is. The next thing is keeping them happy. That involves them being paid respectably and also paying them in a timely manner. And also, because a lot of folk have been dealing with gig apps in which you have access to your money or you're paid oftentimes the same day or the next day or within a couple of days, you also got to deal with that. So what is consistent in my experience in gig app companies is that they pay you fairly decent when they first arrive into a market, when they first enter a market. They're willing to lose, at least short term, but they're always looking long term in that they've got to control the human factor, which is in labor, which is the labor portion of the equation. And that's where a lot of the changes are coming that are soon still. There are changes that we are seeing now, and then there are changes that we'll see in the immediate and distant future. Now, one of those things that we often hear about are the autonomous vehicles. You hear about autonomous vehicles in certain parts of the country that are being a disruptor to rideshare, as we know, as rideshare was once a disruptor to the taxi business. But the autonomous vehicles are a disruptor because guess what? It means that they don't have to pay people. And this is where businesses talk of trying to save money. If you don't have to pay a person, then guess what? You keep more money to earn profits. Pretty simple. Then there are the drones. Same thing, same purpose. It's a way of getting around paying people. Robotics, same thing. Do more, but don't have to pay people. It's quite simple. So then how then do we find our place? Well, that is up to us to be the students of the game. And this is something I mentioned in my latest live stream, as I already stated earlier, in which my daughter, Sarah the Mage, had introduced some material. So I know I talked about a few things in this particular segment of the Gig Geezer, and hopefully you got something out of it. And if you did, hey, if you like the content that's been provided in this segment or in any other segment, hit that subscribe button, give my content a thumbs up, share my content among others, and I definitely welcome your comments in the section below. I'm Inwood Lane. As always, may your grind and may your hustle continue.